January 4th, 1945, 900 a.m. The headquarters of the U.S. Third Army in Luxembourg is a converted chateau, but the air inside is freezing. The radiators are cold, and the only heat comes from a large stone fireplace where logs are crackling. Major General George S. Patton stands with his back to the room, warming his hands. He is the master of the battlefield, the savior of Bastonia, but the man entering the room is not there to congratulate him. A major from the Inspector General's office steps forward. He is nervous. He carries a thick manila folder stamped top secret. Inside are sworn statements, ballistic reports, and a list of names. It is an investigation file that details a mass execution not by the Nazis, but by American soldiers. The major clears his throat and places the file on the heavy oak desk. He expects an order for a court-martial. He expects justice. Patton turns around. He looks at the file, then at the fire, then at the major. He does not open the folder. He does not ask for the names. Instead, he reaches out, grabs the evidence of an American war crime, and walks toward the flames. The major watches in stunned silence as the general prepares to do the unthinkable. He isn't going to punish the killers. He is going to make the crime disappear. And the decision he makes in the next 10 seconds will bury a dark secret for 70 years. To understand why a 4-star general would obstruct justice, you have to stand in the snow of the Ardennes. In the winter of 1944, it was the coldest winter in 30 years. The temperature dropped to 0, freezing the oil in the rifles, turning human skin black with frostbite. But the physical cold was nothing compared to the psychological terror that had gripped the American lines. The Battle of the Bulge wasn't just a military offensive, it was a descent into primal chaos. Rumors were spreading like a virus through the foxholes. There were reports of English-speaking German commandos, led by Otto Skorzeny, wearing American uniforms and slitting throats behind the lines. Every jeep was stopped. Every soldier was questioned. Paranoia was the primary tactic. A young GI wrapping his frozen feet in burlap sacks near Bastonia didn't trust anyone he didn't know personally. The rules of civilized warfare had disintegrated. The Geneva Convention felt like a fairy tale from a different war. Here in the gray forests of Belgium, the only law was survival. The enemy wasn't just the Wehrmacht. It was the SS, the ideological fanatics who had proven they would give no quarter. The emotional undercurrent among the American troops was a simmering, lethal rage. They were tired, they were freezing, and they were looking for a reason to stop taking prisoners. And soon, they would find one. Back in the United States, the public held on to a comforting illusion. They believed that while the Nazis were barbaric monsters who slaughtered the innocent, the American GI was a knight in olive drab. The narrative was clear. We fight by the rules. We treat prisoners with dignity. We are the moral compass of the world. This belief was reinforced by chaplain reading rights on the front lines and officers carrying pristine copies of the field manual on the rules of land warfare. The manual was specific. Prisoners of war must be protected, fed, and housed. Executing a surrendered enemy was murder, punishable by death. But on the front line, the manual was just paper. The reality was a bloody bayonet and a visceral hatred. The illusion of moral superiority was holding, but it was thin. The soldiers knew that the difference between a battle and a massacre was often just a matter of who was watching. The American command believed they could control the violence, that they could unleash killer instincts in their men and then switch them off like a light bulb when the enemy raised their hands. They were wrong. The switch was broken. And the illusion of the clean war was about to be shattered by a single horrific event that would trigger a chain reaction of vengeance. The trigger pulled on December 17, 1944, at a snowy crossroads near Malmedy, Belgium. At exactly 12:30 p.m., a convoy of the American 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion ran into the lead elements of Camp Gruppe Piper, a ruthlessly efficient SS Panzer unit. The Americans were outgunned and surrendered. They were disarmed and heralded into a field south of the crossroads. What happened next is a matter of hard historical record. The SS troopers opened fire with machine guns and pistols. For 10 minutes, the snow turned red. When the shooting stopped, 84 American prisoners of war laid dead in the freezing mud. Some were killed instantly. Others were walked up to and shot in the head at point-blank range as they lay wounded. A handful of survivors played dead, letting the blood of their friends freeze onto their uniforms until nightfall. When they finally sprinted into the woods and reached the American lines, their story didn't just stay in the briefing room. It traveled down the telegraph wires and through the mess halls with the speed of an electric shock. Malmedy. The word became a curse. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a permission slip. The unspoken order went down the line of the U.S. Third Army. The SS are not soldiers. They are animals. And animals do not get the protection of the law. The retaliation did not happen in the heat of an ambush. It was a calculated, cold-blooded, systemic reaction. On January 1, 1945, 2 weeks after Malmedy, the American 11th Armored Division was clearing the village of Chenogne, just a few miles from Bastonia. The fighting was house to house, brutal, and intimate. By the afternoon, the Americans had secured the village and captured a group of German soldiers. Among the prisoners were approximately 60 men of the Waffen-SS. They were easily identifiable by their camouflage-smoking rune collar tabs. They were disarmed. They were marched into a snowy field behind the village. This was not a chaotic firefight. An American machine gunner set up his tripod in the mud. The belt of ammunition was loaded with deliberate care. Eyewitness accounts describe a scene that mirrored Malmedy in reverse. The order was given. The machine gun roared. The 60 German prisoners were cut down in waves. Those who survived the initial burst were finished off with rifles. It was a mass execution, executed by the boys from Ohio and Texas and New York. The Chenogne Massacre was complete. The snow covered the bodies, but it couldn't cover the fact that an entire American unit had just committed a war crime that rivaled the worst atrocities of the enemy. The cycle of vengeance had completed its full rotation. The killing stopped, but the bureaucracy of the army ground on. You cannot hide 60 bodies forever. Rumors reached the rear echelon. On January 2, 1945, the Inspector General's office launched a formal inquiry. This wasn't a casual question, it was a full legal investigation. The investigators moved fast. Within 48 hours, they had collected sworn statements from civilians who watched from their windows. They had testimony from other U.S. officers who had seen the bodies. The file grew thick with undeniable data. It named the unit, the 11th Armored Division. It named the officers responsible. It outlined the charges which, under the Articles of War, carried a mandatory penalty: death by hanging. The investigation identified that this wasn't just a few rogue privates. The implications went up the chain of command. If this went to trial, it wouldn't just be a legal proceeding. It would be a propaganda catastrophe. It would hand Josef Goebbels a weapon to rally the German people. The Americans are the true murderers. The file moved up the ladder stamp by stamp until it reached the highest authority in the sector. It landed on the desk of the Third Army commander on January 4, 1945. The illusion of the moral high ground was trapped inside that manila folder, waiting to be opened. The stone room in Luxembourg is quiet, except for the snapping of the logs in the fireplace. The Inspector General's major watches General Patton's face, waiting for the explosion. He expects Patton to scream, to demand the arrest of the officers, to uphold the discipline he is so famous for. Patton picks up the file. He feels the weight of it. He asks the major in a voice that is dangerously calm what the nature of the allegations is. The major replies, "The killing of prisoners. General, the 11th Armored." Patton nods slowly. He walks over to the fireplace. The orange glow illuminates the deep lines in his face. He looks at the top secret stamp one last time. Then he turns to the major and delivers the verdict that will never be written in any law book. "There are no snipers in this army," Patton says, his voice like gravel, "and I won't have my men prosecuted for killing the sons of Dudder Term, who killed our boys." With a flick of his wrist, he tosses the file into the fire. The paper curls instantly. The dry pages catch the flame turning brown, then black, then crumbling into ash. The names of the killers, the testimony of the witnesses, the justice for the dead. It all goes up the chimney in a wisp of gray smoke. Patton stands there watching it burn, challenging the major to say a word. The major stands frozen. He is a creature of rules and regulations, and he has just watched the highest-ranking officer in the room commit a felony. The silence in the room is deafening. There is no shouting, no debate. The authority of the general is absolute. The major realizes that if he speaks, his career is over. If he leaves, the crime is buried. He salutes. It is a stiff, mechanical movement. Patton does not return it immediately. He is still watching the last embers of the file turn to dust. The major turns and walks out of the heavy oak door, closing it softly behind him. Inside the room, Patton's aide moves to the sideboard to pour a drink. His hand trembles slightly as the glass clinks against the decanter. He knows what he has just witnessed. He knows that outside these walls, the war is fighting for democracy and the rule of law. But inside this room, the law has been suspended. The atmosphere has shifted from administrative tension to a conspiratorial pact. They are no longer just soldiers. They are accomplices. The fire continues to burn, indifferent to the secrets it has just consumed. Why did he do it? Why did George S. Patton, a man who once slapped a soldier for cowardice, protect soldiers who committed murder? The root cause lies in Patton's understanding of the psychology of combat. He viewed the war not as a legal dispute, but as a tribal struggle for survival. Patton knew that the 11th Armored Division was about to be thrown back into the meat grinder. He needed them aggressive. He needed them lethal. He believed that if he court-martialed their officers for killing the SS, he would break the spirit of the division. He would be telling his men that the army cared more about dead Germans than living Americans. Furthermore, Patton held a deep, visceral hatred for the SS. After Malmedy, he had dehumanized the enemy in his own mind. To him, the SS were not soldiers entitled to protection. They were raid dogs. In his calculus, erasing the Chenogne Massacre wasn't a crime. It was a necessary act of command. He prioritized the morale of his living soldiers over the abstract concept of international justice. It was a tactical decision made with a moral blindfold. The consequences on the ground were immediate and tangible. The officers of the 11th Armored Division were not arrested. No MPs showed up to drag men away in handcuffs. The investigation simply evaporated. The soldiers returned to their tanks. They checked their breeches, loaded their shells, and rolled back toward the German lines. But a message had been sent, loud and clear. The rumor spread through the ranks. The old man has our back. the inhibition against killing prisoners vanished. For the rest of the campaign, the fighting in the 11th Armored Sector was particularly savage. If the Germans surrendered, they were often told to keep running. The tactical fallout was a brutal efficiency. The division fought with a desperate, reckless edge, knowing they were untouchable. But the moral fallout was corrosive. Young men who had come to Europe to be liberators had been given a pass to be executioners. The stain of Cheyenne didn't wash off. It just settled deep into the fabric of the unit. A dark bond shared by men who knew they had gotten away with murder because their general had struck the match. History is written by the victors. And for decades, the history books reflected Patton's fire. The Malmedy Massacre became one of the most famous events of World War II. It was prosecuted at the Dachau trials. The SS commander Jochen Peiper became the villain of the narrative. But the Chenogne Massacre vanished. It became a ghost story, whispered by veterans at reunions, but never spoken of in public. There were no trials, there were no hangings. The 11th Armored Division went down in history as heroes of the Bulge, their dark secret buried in the ashes of that fireplace in Luxembourg. It established a dangerous precedent of victor's justice. It proved that war crimes are only prosecuted when you lose. If you win, and if your general is powerful enough, murder becomes a footnote. It wasn't until decades later, when the classified archives were finally opened and old men began to speak before they died, that the full truth of what Patton burned began to emerge. The strategic fallout was a permanent blemish on the legacy of the good war, a reminder that the line between hero and villain is often drawn in ash. We like to remember George S. Patton as the knight in shining armor, the man who raced across France to save the free world. But the truth is more complicated. Patton was a warrior, and warriors are not judges. On that cold January morning, he made a choice between the law and his men, and he chose his men. He saved the soldiers of the 11th Armored from the hangman's noose, but he couldn't save them from their memories. The fire in his office destroyed the paper, but it couldn't burn the image of those 60 men dying in the snow out of the minds of the shooters. As we look back at the rows of white crosses in the American cemeteries in Europe, we must remember that war is not a clean fight between good and evil. It is a descent into madness, where even the best men can do the worst things. Patton's fire didn't purify the war. It just hid the cost. And sometimes, the hardest truth of all is that the heroes we worship are also the men who hold the lighter.